Living up in the hills, we have blackouts every so often. You probably do down here as well, on the flat, I don't know. But we do up in the hills. And it's amazing the difference that a candle will make. So we've got candles and torches spread around the place, just in case. And it's quite remarkable that even one lumen, one candle, can make a significant difference when the house goes completely black. And when you light, when first of all the lights go out, there's kind of this, oh dear, what's happened? And you're somewhat alarmed and unsteady. But as soon as you light even just one candle, it brings a sort of calm and a peace, because you're saying, oh, there is some light here with which we can conduct our business. So candles are great, if they're used properly. Because, of course, if you're in the darkness and you've lit a candle and then you cover that candle, you may as well not have lit the candle in the first place, right? Because it just blends back into the darkness. Or if you light a candle in the middle of the day and take it outdoors, you can have a decoration, I suppose. It looks good, but it's not fit for purpose, is it? It's not actually giving you any light. It's not doing what it was intended to do. So candles are great when they're used for their proper purpose. And of course, this illustrates a truth with respect to evangelism. This is the series that we're doing at the moment, is on evangelism, and it's really kind of a how-to. What must we do to evangelize? And we're going through 3 aspects of what it will take to evangelize. And last week we looked at the idea that in order to be effective in evangelism, we need to have coordination, which is structure and strategy. And God's structure has always been God's people organized together. And God's strategy has always been that God's people love one another. And so this idea of being well connected to one another in order to help other people come to know Jesus is really important. Today, what we're going to be looking at is the need for us to be connected to non-Christians. So last week, be well connected to believers. This week, be well connected to unbelievers. And this is where that metaphor of the light, of the candle, comes in. Remember in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said that we're meant to be like a light that's set on the hill, that gives light to the whole, that gives light to the whole house. We're meant to be that light. But if the light's not shining in the darkness, then it's not doing its job. So what I want to do as we look at being well connected to other people is kind of look at the 2 extremes, because the 2 extremes are one that we're covering up the light, and we're so culturally adapted that people who are not Christians can't really see any difference between us and them. And so the light's not giving off any light. That's covering the light with the basket. And the other extreme, of course, is that we're so isolated that the light's not shining in the darkness. We don't have any meaningful contact with non-Christians, and so therefore that's like the candle being lit in the middle of the day. It's not actually bringing any light to bear on the darkness. They're the 2 extremes, and that we need to avoid. Just before we look at those, let's remind ourselves of what evangelism is. So this, I think, is one of the best definitions of evangelism that I've come across. Evangelism is helping or taking the initiative to help a person move one step closer to Jesus. So evangelism is taking the initiative, which means you do something deliberately to help somebody else move closer to Jesus. Evangelism doesn't necessarily mean that you're the one who brings somebody to Jesus. That's wonderful, that's great, but you might be just one of the links in the chain. But evangelism is a cooperative effort by the church. And you might be the one who manages to convince a non-Christian that all Christians aren't crazy and maybe there's something in this Christianity. And then someone else might take them further, and someone else might take them further. So evangelism is taking the initiative to help a person move one step closer to Jesus. That means, therefore, if it's us taking the initiative, that evangelism involves us being connected well to non-Christians, to unbelievers. And so here are the 2 extremes. So we want to be that candle that's giving light to the whole house. But on one extreme, you've got compromise, where we're so blended in with the culture that they can't see any light. And then the other extreme, you've got isolation, where we might be shining brightly and all together, but we're not having any bearing on the darkness because we're not really surrounded by those who are living in the darkness as much as we could be. So we're going to look at those two extremes and put them in the positive. So first of all, two ways that we should connect well with people, connect well with unbelievers particularly. Number one, be wise, not compromised. We connect well with people by being wise, not by being compromised. So let me give you this little chart here. I'm sure you're aware of this. Most people aren't really cognizant of this process, but this is what happens in our life. So with respect to our faith, we have beliefs. And those beliefs should shape our values. Those values shape our goals. Those goals shape our behaviour. So therefore, if I look at your behaviour during the week, tomorrow I follow you around and I look at your behaviour, then that's going to tell me what your goals are. I should be able to discern from your behaviour what your goals are. As I work out your goals, that tells me then what your values are. And then as I work out what your values are, I can pretty well determine what it is that you believe. What it is that you believe about God, what it is you believe about yourself, what it is you believe about the world. It's kind of how it works. So with respect to Christians, ideally, we believe in the Scriptures. We believe in the one true God, our Trinitarian God. So therefore, because of our faith, we have values that we trust are biblically based. We value evangelism. We want people to be saved. We value people full stop because we believe everybody's made in the image of God. We want to see the gospel proceed throughout the world, so we value mission. We support the church because we recognize that is God's plan to reach the world and to grow Christians, and so we're involved in the church. So these are our values. So therefore we have goals, and we have prayer goals, we have Bible reading goals, we have witnessing goals, we have giving goals, whatever it might be. And then therefore, when you walk with us and you follow us around, you'll see us practicing prayer, you'll see us practicing Bible reading, you'll see us seeking to be kind and giving and serving to those that are in need and those that don't know Jesus. You'll see us involved in church. You see how it works? But with the culture, they also do the same thing. Everybody does the same thing. So in our culture, let's say you take the typical Aussie who doesn't have a faith, doesn't believe religion is all that important. Well, they'll believe in evolution, that they've come from a monkey. They'll believe that the best thing to do is to aggrandize yourself, get as much comfort as you can, see as many places as you can. It's all about them and their family, maybe. That would be their beliefs, so therefore that's their values. They value entertainment, they value personal fulfillment, they value travel, whatever it might be. So that's their goals. They'll have a bucket list. We want to see these places. We want to live in this kind of a house. We want to drive these kind of cars. And therefore, they will practice those practices that will help them to achieve those goals. So they'll seek to make as much money as they can, or they'll seek to go on as many holidays as they can, or they'll basically prioritize themselves and maybe their families. So when it says be wise, not compromised, what we mean is make sure that your faith, your Christian faith, is really shaping who you are. Make sure your Christian faith is really shaping your beliefs, from which come your values, from which come your goals, from which comes your behavior. Because to the degree that our culture dominates our faith, we are compromised. To the degree that we are buying into the world's beliefs and to the world's values and to the world's goals, and therefore the world's practices, to that same degree our faith is compromised and our light does not shine. Does that make sense? So that's what it means to be wise and not compromised. It means to understand that this is what happens in our life. That we can track what it is that we value by our practices. So we need to make sure that our faith has a huge, central, overwhelming, saturating impact on our values, goals, and practices. in order that we are not compromised, so that we have a witness. Okay, so in order to be wise, not compromised, let's learn from negative examples. I just picked 2 churches in the New Testament, in the early church. Could have picked a lot more. But it always amuses me when people say idealistically, oh, we need to get back to the early church. And I always sort of think, well, that's interesting. Which church do you have in mind? The Corinthian church was as secular as you want it to be. If you went to the Corinthian church, you would not go back again. You'd visit once and then you'd leave. If you went to the Laodicean church, you'd visit once and then you'd leave. In fact, the New Testament epistles are letters written by apostles or those with the apostles to churches to deal with certain problems that those churches were having. So every church pretty much in the New Testament that's mentioned had some issues, and they had letters that were written to them to address those issues. So Christians in churches have always, from the beginning, had trouble with assimilation to culture. They've always had this problem of there being too much of their surrounding culture in their church. And that's why the epistles have been written. So we must understand that, right? So you think of the Corinthian church. You've got 16 chapters in Corinth. Almost every chapter is dealing with an issue. The first 4 chapters are dealing with schisms. So they had splits in the church, and there were at least four distinct groups within the church, all competing with each other for prominence. Then in chapter 5, it talks about incest and immorality that's not even mentioned in the world. There was a couple who were engaged in some kind of incestuous relationship, and the church wasn't doing anything about it. In fact, the church was enabling it, saying, how gracious are we that we can put up with this kind of behavior in our midst? And Paul goes, that's just crazy. In chapter 6, you had believers from the same church taking each other to a secular court. That didn't look good. Chapter 6, you also had promiscuity from the men. They were still having troubles going to temple prostitutes. That's not great for Christians. Chapter 7, you've got issues of marriage and divorce. People were getting divorced and remarriage, and it was out of control. So Paul writes chapter 7 to deal with that. Chapters 8, 9, and 10 have to do with food being offered to idols. So they were still going to pagan temples, to kind of like a restaurant, and eating this food that was sacrificed to idols. But behind the idols were demons. And so Paul says that's not a good idea. Stop that practice. Too much of the culture in your church, Corinth. And 12, 13, 14... chapter 11, they've got issues in chapter 11 with the Lord's table. They weren't respecting each other. Chapters 12, 13, and 14, they've got issues with spiritual gifts. They were all self-centered, seeking prominence. They weren't loving one another as they ought to. Chapter 15, they had the resurrection wrong. What a church! What an ensemble of issues to deal with. Completely culturally compromised. And so we read that book, and we say, well, Paul is still fighting for that church, so therefore that's significant. But it's really important that the church gets its act together and is holy, and as believers that we are holy. Laodicea is the same. They thought they were doing okay. They were quite wealthy. They were quite... they thought they had all that they needed, and the Lord Jesus said to them, you guys are so lukewarm that I just want to spew you out of my mouth. I want to vomit you out. You make me sick. Church. So let's learn from these negative examples throughout church history and recognize that in every age, the church struggles with cultural assimilation. Too much of the culture in the church. We have to be growing in our faith, discerning our culture well, in order to be able to resist that cultural assimilation. So the answer to cultural assimilation is not isolation. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's being strong in our faith, and it's being able to discern our culture so that we can see what's happening in our culture, what influences are coming to bear on us as believers, on our families, as well as on our churches. Because our culture will constantly, 24/7, every week, every year, will constantly seek to get us to compromise. That is the devil's strategy. If you're a Christian, you have an enemy. He's called the devil. He is seeking to have you compromise your individual faith. He wants your family to be compromised. He wants this church to be compromised. He wants you to adopt erroneous beliefs so that will help, therefore, change your values, change your goals, and therefore change your practices. So that's why we need to be culturally discerning, particularly when it comes to entertainment, across the board, music and movies and TV and whatever else it might be. Be discerning. We need to take the scriptures, take our belief system, and use it as a grid through which we analyze our culture. So we've got to be good interpreters of the Bible. We also have to be good interpreters of our culture so that we don't let in that which we ought not to let in that will actually undermine what it is that we believe. In contrast, we need to look to influence our culture for good, which means we need to be in the culture as much as we can, seeking to bless the culture. So here I think of someone like Daniel or someone like Joseph in the Old Testament. So Joseph rises to become the second in control of Egypt and has a tremendous impact on the whole culture, saves many people from starvation. Daniel likewise rises right up to the top of the political administration when the Jews are in exile, Babylon then Persia, and has a tremendous influence for good. But he didn't compromise his faith. So the answer is not isolation, but still being involved, but being involved in a discerning manner. But to be involved, of course, we've got to be connected, so we've got to move towards it. And of course, we need to be countercultural when needed. So there are times when we just simply have to flat refuse to go along with the culture. So we're talking like transgender ideology. Sorry, a man cannot become a woman and a woman cannot become a man. We're not moving on that one. We're going to be countercultural on that one. Sorry, homosexual marriage, there is no such thing. Two men cannot marry from a biblical perspective. Two women cannot marry from a biblical perspective. Marriage is between a husband and a wife. We are countercultural on that. And we always will be if the culture changes, because the culture has changed. 20, 30 years ago, the culture said, marriage is between a man and a woman, and two men can't get married. And they also said that a man couldn't become a woman. But the last 20 years, the culture has changed. And the pressure is on the church to change with the culture. But when we need to be countercultural and just not buy into the nonsense. So that's what it means to be wise and not compromised, so that we can keep our light shining, so that we actually have, the whole point is that when we're with unbelievers, they see the difference that Christ makes. Not in that we are judgy, and not in that we are Bible thumpers, but they see the difference that grace makes in our life. They see that we stand for truth and for beauty and for goodness, and that makes a difference in how we do relationships and how we work and how we live. And as they have more to do with us, they'll see that difference. The light will be shining. But if we allow our lives to look more and more like their lives, being motivated by their goals and their values, because they're motivated by their beliefs, then the light that we emit will become dim and almost be extinguished. So, first way to connect well with unbelievers is to be wise, not compromised. Now let's look at the isolation extreme. Second way to connect well with people is by being present, not absent. Sounds simple, doesn't it? But not so, perhaps. So be present, not absent, with intentionality. So Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20 is the Great Commission, one of 5 places where it's mentioned, one in each of the Gospels and also in Acts chapter 1, verse 8. But I think I mentioned this last time, but if you have a look at Matthew 28, verse 18, sometimes you'll hear this preached as the key commandment in the verse. It's not the key commandment. After his resurrection, Jesus had the disciples. Verse 16, the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain where Jesus had told them to go. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. Then Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you, and surely I am with you always to the very end of the age. So, wonderful structure there, because Jesus bookends what he says, this commission that he gives to the apostles, by saying, you have my power. That's verse 18, and then he finishes in verse 20 by saying, you have my presence. So you've got my power, you've got my presence, so therefore, knowing that you have my power with you, knowing that you have my presence with you, make disciples of all nations while you go. So go there is not a command. It's an assumption. While going, make disciples. There's the command. There's the main verb in that passage. We're commanded to make disciples of all nations while we go. So there is an implicit understanding from Jesus that we are on the move with the gospel. Not that we're necessarily moving from country to country or state to state, but as we move through life, we're taking the gospel with us and we're seeking to impact others with that gospel. So that's intentionality. While you're going, make sure you're making disciples. John chapter 4, the story of Jesus and the Samaritan woman, in verse 1, it starts with this wonderful use of this Greek word dei, D-E-I is the transliteration, which means it is necessary. It says that Jesus must go through Samaria on his way back to Galilee. Normally they wouldn't go through Samaria because the Jews didn't like the Samaritans, and they would do this big detour to avoid their place. But in John chapter 4, verse 1, Jesus says, I must go through Samaria. Why must he go through Samaria? To meet the Samaritan woman. Someone who was on the bottom of the social pile. So she was a woman, so that put her down below the men. And then she was a Samaritan, so that put her below the Jews. And then she was a woman who was immoral, so that put her even below the Samaritan women, normally. So she was right on the bottom of the social pecking order. But Jesus said, I've got to go through Samaria. I've got to take this particular journey to meet this particular lady and to share with her the gospel, which Jesus does. She comes to faith, and then she impacts the whole city of Samaria. Jesus was very intentional with respect to his evangelism. And then if I read to you John 17, when Jesus is praying to his Father in heaven, this is truly the Lord's Prayer, John chapter 17. This is what he says. This is how he prays. Look at verse 15. Jesus prays to his Father. He says, my prayer is not that you take them out of the world, but that you protect them from the evil one. So I don't want them isolated, but I do want them protected. But I don't want them isolated. They are not of the world, even as I am not of it. Sanctify them by the truth. Your word is truth. As you sent me into the world, I have sent them into the world. For them I sanctify myself, that they too may be truly sanctified. So there's a commission. He says, I don't want them to be isolated, my disciples, but I want them to be into the world because you sent me into the world. I'm now sending them into the world, but they're going to be under attack, so I pray for protection upon them. Intentionality. And then you connect that with the Great Commission in Matthew, Luke, Mark, Luke, John, and the book of Acts. And you see that God very much wants us to be intentional about reaching people with the gospel. But in order to reach people with the gospel, we have to be around people. We are to be present with people with compassion. This is the story of Jonah. So remember, God's plan in the Old Testament to reach the world was to raise up the nation of Israel. And Israel was to so enjoy God and so love one another, as per the law, love God from the heart, that the nations would see that God was real. So Israel had an evangelistic purpose from the start as a nation. They had forgotten that, and they became very insular. Thus, the book of Jonah, I think, is a huge lesson to Israel to be evangelistic, because God sends Jonah to Nineveh to share with them the good news, but he doesn't want to go because that was Israel's heart. Israel had a hard heart. And when he does go, and he does reluctantly preach the gospel, he still wants their destruction. And God says at the end of that book, at the end of the book of Jonah, there's hundreds of thousands of people here who don't know their left hand from the right. And you're more concerned about a plant than you are about people's eternal souls. That's not right, Jonah. You haven't got my heart for people. Israel, you don't have my heart for people. Our God is a God of compassion. And that's why he wants us to reach as many people as possible, because he has compassion on them. So we are to be present with compassion. We are to be present with responsiveness as well. So have a look at Acts chapter 1, verse 8. This is the key verse of the book of Acts, by the way. So one verse you're going to memorize in the book of Acts, it's this one, because it gives you both the theme of the book and the breakup of the book. Jesus, again talking to his disciples, gives them the Great Commission, but in a different way. He says, "But you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes on you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem," Acts chapters 1 to 7, "and in Judea and Samaria," Acts chapters 8 to 12, "and to the ends of the earth," Acts chapter 13 to 28. So, right at the front, before they receive the Spirit, Jesus says to them, "You're going to receive the Holy Spirit, and I want you intentionally to be my witnesses here in this city, Jerusalem, but then I want you to take the gospel out to the surrounding regions of Judea and Samaria, and then I want you to take it out to the rest of the world." So what does the early church do? Acts chapters 1 through 7. They stay in Jerusalem. They have no intention of going anywhere else, because surely the gospel is only for the Jews. But Jesus said, no, he must have, we must have misheard what he said. So you jump over to chapter 8, verse 1. What does God do? Because the first 7 chapters, they're in Jerusalem. Chapter 8, verse 1. Easy to remember, 1:8 and 8:1. On that day, the day of Saul's persecution, his death, on that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Well, how about that? Jesus tells them to go to Judea and Samaria after they witnessed in Jerusalem. They witness in Jerusalem and they don't go anywhere. So what happens? God allows for a great persecution to scatter them into the next regions. He forces them to go because they weren't intuitive, they weren't responsive to his command. And so they go out to Judea and Samaria. And they're very effective. And then during this period, when they're in Judea and Samaria, they're still struggling because they're saying, well, the gospel's for the Jews, Samaritans are half Jews, so we can almost let them in, okay, but certainly not the Gentiles. So then God has to give Peter a dream, and through this dream, he tells Peter that the gospel is also for the Gentiles, non-Jews, Romans. And so he goes and he meets with Cornelius. Cornelius gets saved. Peter gets a revelation and goes back to the Jerusalem council and says, hey guys, guess what? When Jesus said take the gospel to the ends of the earth, he actually meant the ends of the earth. And so there you have chapter 13. The Apostle Paul comes along and he takes the gospel to the ends of the earth. So we need to be responsive. We need to be in tune with God's heart. God's heart is not for a holy huddle. God's heart is for our holy huddle to be so holy that we can't contain our love for Jesus and our love for the lost, and we are intentionally moving amongst the non-Christians to see as many people saved as possible. So how can we do that? So here's some practical application in terms of how do we be present, not absent, because many of you tomorrow will go to work and you'll be surrounded by non-Christians, or maybe this afternoon you'll be around family members who are not Christians. When you go back to your house, you'll have neighbours around you who are not Christians. You might have friends who are not Christians. So be present prayerfully. So as Alan was telling the kids, pray. I mean, if you haven't started already, start praying deliberately for individuals to come to faith. I'm convinced that no one comes to faith unless they're prayed for. I think that's part of the way in which God has set things up. Don't have a Bible verse for it, but I think it makes sense. So pray for individuals to come to faith. And pray regularly for them. Practical presence. So when you're working, work with integrity and serve with kindness. Let people see the difference that Christ makes because of the attitude that you bring to your workplace and the work that you do. So this is Titus chapter 2, where Paul tells the servants and the slaves to so honour their masters that their masters will see the difference that Christ has made in them. So work with integrity, serve with kindness. Relational presence. Listen well, show genuine interest in people. So many of us are introverts. So introverts don't like sort of to put themselves out there in relationships. But what we can do quite well is listen. Or we should be able to do that quite well. Ask people questions. Take a genuine interest in people. Be curious. Find out what makes them tick. What are their beliefs? What are their values? What are their goals? You don't have to criticize them. You don't have to judge them for them. But you can find out what they are. And then that might help you as you seek to develop the relationship as how you best witness to them. Vocal presence. Declare your faith. So I don't mean necessarily Bible bash, but I mean if you're in a non-Christian environment in your workplace or even your neighborhood or with your family, make sure that they know where you stand. It doesn't have to be a sermon that you give, but just let them know that you go to church. Let them know that you're a Christian. Let them know that you enjoy being a Christian. Let them know that Jesus is your Savior. Just plant the flag. Plant the flag, and then all of a sudden you have to rally around that flag in the future. If you don't plant the flag of your faith wherever you are, it means that you could be squishy. You're adaptable to the culture that you're in, and you can do what Peter did when he denied Jesus 3 times if you wanted to. Cultural presence. Be in the community. This is one that I don't do so well. So this is where I need to grow. Be in the community. So if you're fishing, I think you're meant to go where the fish are. I think that's part of fishing. I don't know. I'm not a fisherman. But I figure if you sort of filled your bathtub with water and just fished in there, it'd be really convenient. I'd like doing that. I mean, I wouldn't catch anything, but you never do anyway, do you, when you go? No. But that's not the point of fishing, right? You're meant to, where are the fish? And then you go to, that's why they guys buy the boats and they get the radars and all the rest of it, and they throw out what do you throw out over the side? The stuff, the stinky stuff. The burley, that's it. You throw the burley out to track the fish. So you're meant to be where the fish are. Otherwise, you can't really call yourself a fisherman, right? So where are the people? Well, they're playing sport. I mean, don't go on a Sunday morning, but otherwise, you can get involved in sport. You don't have to play a sport to get involved in a club because every sporting club is crying out for volunteers to help manage and administer their clubs. So you could do that. You can get involved in politics. No problem getting involved in politics. Our political parties need more Christians in them to influence their thinking. Schools, you can get involved in the schools. There's various hobbies you could get involved with. We could get involved with. So cultural presence. This is intentionality. So Tom here is a part of a walking group, the Addie Mills walking group. So he chats away with all these ladies as he walks, seeking to see them come to faith. Isn't that right, Tom?
We talk a little bit while we're walking. The ladies walk a little bit while they talk.
Right. All complaints to Tom afterwards. And then, of course, consistent presence. We need to, whenever we're involved, show up regularly so that we can be that consistent light in the darkness. So, here's our big idea this morning. Be well connected to people to help them move closer to Jesus. So last week, be well connected to the church so that we as a church can be more effective at helping people move closer to Jesus. But now also we need to be well connected to unbelievers so that we can help them to move closer to Jesus. But let's do so in a way that doesn't see us assimilate to the culture, and so we don't have anything to show, we don't have any light to shine, but let's also be intentional so that we're not keeping to ourselves. Be well connected to Jesus, and so let's let our light shine. Well, thank you for being with us this morning.